What if an entire nation believed victories that never happened and sacrificed everything based on carefully crafted deceptions? Japan's wartime government weaponized propaganda to justify brutal expansion while concealing devastating defeats from its own people, leading millions to fight and die for lies they never questioned. They called it liberation, but the territories Japan conquered experienced something far darker than freedom. Soldiers were told capture meant unspeakable torture, driving them toward a fate more tragic than surrender. Even as their forces crumbled, Japanese citizens celebrated phantom victories while reality closed in around them. The truth they finally discovered would shatter everything they believed about their nation's sacred mission. The promise of liberation. Japan told the world they were liberators. They claimed to be freeing Asia from Western control, promising a new era of unity and prosperity. But behind this noble-sounding mission lay a darker truth. The territories Japan conquered didn't experience freedom. They experienced occupation. Villages were taken over, resources stripped away, and local populations forced to serve Japan's war effort. This wasn't liberation, it was exploitation disguised with careful words. The Japanese government created a special term for their plan, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. It sounded like partnership, like cooperation between equals. But the reality on the ground told a completely different story. Civilians in occupied lands soon discovered that Japan's version of prosperity meant their suffering. Their crops fed Japanese soldiers, their young men were forced into labor projects, and anyone who resisted faced severe consequences. But this lie about liberation was only the beginning of Japan's deception campaign. The co-prosperity lie. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere wasn't just propaganda, it was one of history's most successful branding campaigns for conquest. Japanese officials traveled to occupied territories with promises of independence and mutual benefit. They set up puppet governments that looked independent on paper but answered directly to Tokyo. Local leaders who cooperated received titles and positions. Those who didn't simply disappeared. Meanwhile, Japan extracted everything valuable from these lands. Rice, oil, metals, rubber, all flowed back to fuel the Japanese military machine. Workers labored in harsh conditions, often without proper food or rest. Families were separated as young men were taken for forced labor projects. Women faced unimaginable treatment that the Japanese government would deny for decades. The occupied populations quickly learned that Japan's promise of Asian brotherhood was hollow. They had simply traded one colonial master for another, one that might be even more demanding. And Japan needed a story to explain why this conquest was necessary in the first place. The self-defense myth. Japan didn't call their expansion an invasion. That word suggested aggression, conquest, and wrongdoing. Instead, the government told their people and the world that Japan was defending itself. They claimed Western nations had cornered them economically, leaving no choice but to fight for survival. When America and other countries imposed sanctions over Japan's actions in China, Japanese propaganda turned this into proof of Western aggression. Radio broadcasts told citizens that Japan was the victim, surrounded by enemies who wanted to destroy their way of life. Newspapers published articles explaining how the war was forced upon them. School children learned that Japan's military actions were noble acts of self-preservation. This framing was powerful because it contained a grain of truth. Economic pressures were real, but it twisted context and ignored Japan's own aggressive expansion that had triggered those pressures. The self-defense narrative made soldiers feel righteous and civilians feel justified in their sacrifices. But as the war progressed, hiding the truth from their own people became even more critical. The censorship machine. The Japanese government understood that controlling information meant controlling reality. They built a censorship system so tight that most citizens had no idea what was really happening. Newspapers couldn't publish stories without government approval. Radio broadcasts were scripted and monitored. Letters from soldiers at the front were read and edited before reaching families. Any information that suggested Japan might be struggling was simply erased. When horrific events occurred, mass civilian deaths, war crimes, brutal treatment of prisoners, the news never reached Japanese homes. The government even censored information going to the West, issuing statements claiming prisoners of war were treated with honor and respect, following ancient warrior traditions.
They spoke of Bushido values, the way of the warrior, suggesting captured enemies received dignified treatment. In reality, conditions in prison camps told a completely different story. But with information controlled so tightly, both Japanese citizens and much of the outside world believed what they were told. This control over truth would prove essential as Japan's military situation began to collapse. Victories that never happened. Imperial General Headquarters faced a problem. Japan was losing battles. Ships were sinking, planes were being shot down, soldiers weren't coming home. But the government couldn't let citizens know this. So they did something remarkable. They invented victories. When Japan suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Midway, losing 4 aircraft carriers and many experienced pilots, the government announced a great triumph. Newspapers celebrated, families rejoiced. No one knew that this battle had fundamentally shifted the war's balance, putting Japan on a path it couldn't reverse. This wasn't a one-time deception. Battle after battle, loss after loss, the reports sent home spoke of glorious success. Civilians listened to radio broadcasts describing enemy ships destroyed and territories secured. Reality and official reports existed in separate worlds. Mothers whose sons died in failed operations received letters explaining their boys had fallen in victorious campaigns. The disconnect between truth and propaganda grew so wide that Japanese citizens lived in an alternate reality. But phantom victories weren't the only lie keeping soldiers fighting.
The enemy you should fear. Japanese propaganda created a terrifying image of Allied forces, especially Americans. Soldiers and civilians were told that capture meant certain torture, not just imprisonment, but specific, horrific fates. Government materials described Americans as barbaric, claiming they would mutilate prisoners, commit unspeakable acts, and take gruesome trophies. These weren't vague warnings. They were detailed, graphic descriptions designed to inspire absolute terror. The message was clear: death was preferable to capture. This lie had devastating consequences. On islands like Saipan and Okinawa, entire families chose to jump from cliffs rather than face American soldiers. Japanese troops fought to the last man, not from bravery alone, but from genuine belief that surrender meant something worse than death. Soldiers who might have lived threw themselves into hopeless charges. Civilians who could have survived killed themselves and their children. The propaganda was so effective that even when Americans tried to encourage surrender, offering safety and food, few believed them. Yet another lie kept hope alive even as reality crumpled around them. Divine destiny and willpower. The Japanese government promoted a powerful idea. Japan was special, chosen, protected by divine forces. This wasn't just patriotism, it was a quasi-religious belief system woven into wartime propaganda. Citizens were taught that Japan possessed a unique spiritual strength that made them different from other nations. This spiritual superiority would carry them to victory, regardless of material disadvantages. When faced with America's massive industrial capacity, factories producing ships, planes, and weapons at staggering rates, Japanese propaganda emphasized spirit over steel. They told soldiers that willpower and dedication to the emperor would overcome American machinery. Schools taught children that dying for Japan was the highest honor possible. This narrative served multiple purposes. It explained away material shortages, justified continued sacrifice, and made surrender unthinkable. The shame of giving up wasn't just military or political, it was spiritual. To surrender meant betraying something sacred. This belief system was so deeply embedded that it influenced decisions at every level, from individual soldiers to military commanders. But why did these lies work so effectively for so long? The culture that made lies possible. Japan's wartime deceptions succeeded partly because they built upon existing cultural values. Japanese society emphasized loyalty, hierarchy, and duty above individual concerns. Questioning authority wasn't just discouraged, it was culturally unacceptable. When the government spoke, citizens listened. When newspapers printed stories, people believed them. This wasn't because Japanese citizens were naive, but because their entire social structure reinforced trust in official sources. Additionally, the concept of honor carried immense weight. The shame of surrender, the glory of sacrifice, the duty to emperor and nation. These weren't just propaganda slogans, but deeply held values. The government didn't create these beliefs from nothing. They amplified and weaponized existing cultural elements. Combined with strict censorship that prevented alternative information sources, this created an environment where propaganda flourished. Families had no way to verify what they were told. Soldiers had no access to broader strategic information. The government controlled the complete information environment, and cultural values made questioning that information almost impossible. This combination of lies had consequences that extended far beyond military defeats.
The human cost of deception. The lies Japan spread didn't just affect military strategy. They caused immeasurable human suffering. Soldiers who believed capture meant torture fought in hopeless situations rather than surrender, leading to unnecessary deaths. Civilians on islands like Okinawa and Saipan, convinced Americans would harm them, chose mass death over survival. Families mourned sons they believed had died in glorious victories, never knowing the true circumstances of their deaths. In occupied territories, populations suffered under brutal conditions while Japan told the world they were being liberated. The lies extended the war's duration as surrender became unthinkable both militarily and culturally. Even after 2 atomic weapons were used and the situation became hopeless, powerful figures in the Japanese government resisted ending the war, still believing in divine intervention or miracle weapons. When surrender finally came, many Japanese citizens experienced profound shock, not just at losing, but at discovering how thoroughly they'd been deceived. The psychological impact of learning that victories were fabrications and sacrifices were based on lies affected an entire generation. But the story doesn't end with Japan's surrender in 1945. The truth emerges. When the war ended, reality came crashing through the propaganda walls. Japanese citizens learned the truth about battles they thought were won. Families discovered that occupied territories hadn't experienced liberation, but exploitation and suffering. Soldiers returning from Allied prison camps reported they hadn't been treated with the cruelty propaganda had promised, which created its own troubling questions about what they'd been told. The full extent of actions taken in occupied territories began emerging, contradicting years of official denials. The contrast between propaganda and reality was so stark that many struggled to process it. Some couldn't believe the new information, thinking it was American propaganda. Others felt betrayed by their own government. The carefully constructed narrative of divine destiny and righteous war collapsed. Japan's post-war identity crisis stemmed partly from this massive gap between what citizens believed during the war and what actually happened. And some of these lies continued long after the war ended. Legacy and lessons. Even after 1945, some of these wartime lies persisted. Denial of certain actions continued for decades. Textbooks minimized or omitted uncomfortable truths. Political debates over how to remember the war continued into the 21st century. But the story of Japan's wartime propaganda offers crucial lessons about information, control, and truth. It shows how governments can create alternate realities when they control what people see and hear. It demonstrates that lies don't need to be believable, they just need to be the only story available. The tragedy wasn't just military defeat, but the human cost of systematic deception. Families destroyed, lives lost unnecessarily, and a nation's trust in its own government shattered. Understanding these lies matters today because the tools of propaganda, controlling information, creating fear, appealing to national pride, silencing alternative voices, haven't disappeared. They've simply evolved. The greatest lies Japan spread during the Pacific War remind us why free information, multiple perspectives, and the courage to question official narratives remain essential in any society. The truth may be painful, but it's always better than even the most comfortable lie. The greatest Japan war lies during the Pacific War reveal how propaganda shaped an entire nation's reality. From Pearl Harbor to Midway, Japanese W-2 propaganda transformed defeats into phantom victories, while kamikaze pilots believed myths about divine protection. Imperial Japan convinced millions that surrender meant torture, leading to tragic choices at Okinawa and Saipan. Even discussions around Hiroshima and Nagasaki were clouded by years of deception. Understanding these Pacific War myths reminds us why questioning official narratives matters today. If this story opened your eyes to how information controls reality, share it with someone who values truth over comfortable deceptions.